I wanted to riff a bit on the title of the exhibition and to try and show you not only this huge divergence between what Rockwell represents and what Pollock represented in the time when they were both alive at the same time, but also some of the things that they actually had in common. So I'm going to start out by showing you that they both had United States postage stamps. Rockwell's was done in 1994 and Pollock's 5 years later. And I'm going to point out some of the interesting similarities and differences in the way the stamps were treated. Now, Rockwell stamp was based on his triple self-portrait, which is actually in the other gallery, so you can see the original right there. And you'll notice that one of the things he did for himself was to, first of all, take off his eyeglasses. Second of all, change his pipe to a jaunty upward movement rather than the downward movement in the original. And in Pollock's case, they wouldn't allow him to smoke at all. See right here in the Martha Holmes photograph? Cigarette went away. A few other things went away too, like the junk in the background, gone. They cloned this painting and added it as a background. And also, as you'll notice, they colorized it. Now, a lot of people complained about the cigarette going away, but in fact, the woman who took the photograph, Martha Holmes, was living when this was done, and she gave her permission for them to edit it. She was just really pleased that they wanted to use her picture, even though she didn't really get credit for it. But what I think is so remarkable is that Rockwell is allowed not only to smoke, but to drink. Don't you think maybe that's a bourbon he's got over there? Or is it a Coca-Cola? We'll never know, and he won't tell. Also, they have in common open and interpreted studios kept intact. Ours at the Pollock-Krasner house was deeded to us by Lee Krasner's estate, and it actually represents both artists. Lee Krasner used the studio after Pollock's death in 1956 for a further 28 years. So you see on the walls, you can see some marks from her abstract paintings that were tacked up on the walls, but of course Exhibit A is the studio floor on which Pollock painted almost all of his really famous poured paintings. The reason we have this is because the floor was covered in 1953. After he'd been working on it for 6 years, he renovated the building and insulated it. And when that white wallboard was installed, the floor was covered in white masonite. So that's why it was preserved, even though it was done inadvertently. It wasn't done to preserve it, but when we turned it into a museum, we simply took up the floor covering and voila, there it was. And of course the Rockwell studio, which was moved from downtown Stockbridge and is here on the grounds of the museum, is also intact. And it really, I think it's very valuable for visitors to come and actually see where the artists worked and get a sense of their environment, their surroundings, what they had in their studio, what they worked with. And of course in Pollock's case, because the art is so abstract, it's very helpful to look outside and see the natural world that inspired him. In Rockwell's case, of course, he was often inspired by his friends and neighbors who would wander past the building while it was in downtown. And I understand just a few days ago there was a Rockwell model reunion. Is that right? I think that's so wonderful that there are people who are still around who were his models and can come back and enjoy seeing their own picture right there on the wall. They also have a biographer in common. How funny is that? Deborah Solomon's biography of Pollock came out in 1987 and her Rockwell biography in 2013. And of course, Rockwell actually emulated Pollock when he was painting the studies and the actual cover of the Connoisseur in 1961. Here you see Pollock at work in the top right, the photograph by Martha Holmes. He's painting number 1, 1949, and down below in the lower left, he's painting Autumn Rhythm in 1950. That photograph is by Hans Namath. And these pictures, of course, were extremely influential. Life magazine, as I'll show you, was really a game changer for Pollock. And of course, both of these artists owe a tremendous amount of their success to these popular weekly magazines. Collier's, The Post, the Saturday Evening Post, the Life magazine, Look magazine, Time magazine, Harper's Bazaar, Vogue magazine, all of these publications helped to disseminate the artwork and also the ideas that the artists were trying to promote to a much wider audience than, say, Art News or Art in America, the smaller circulation, more focused and more specialized magazines. Now, here's Rockwell's triple self-portrait, and it shows you that this is not somebody who was working in a vacuum. Rockwell was a very sophisticated man, very knowledgeable, and he obviously knew that what he was doing was very different from what modern artists were doing, but he still felt that he had some kinship with them, and he expressed this by putting up a few reproductions, just tacked right on the canvas. This is Peter Bruegel's self-portrait. This is a Rembrandt self-portrait. This is a Van Gogh self-portrait. And of course, here's a Picasso self-portrait. A very unusual Picasso self-portrait, by the way, because in most of Picasso's self-portraits, the artist is front and center. He's saying, yo, Picasso. In this one, he's reduced to a silhouette behind this stylized female figure, and he's literally in the background of his own work. And interestingly, we've got the Jasper Johns in there that shows you another of the silhouette, the uses of the silhouette as a portrait device. And oh, and I have to say, I have to take my hat off to Stephanie. She has done a fabulous job putting this show together, and she's chosen some wonderful examples to juxtapose the two parallel tracks that art was running on during the period in question. Now, in 1949, for some reason, a fellow named Russell Lines got it into his head to categorize and codify the different types of American taste. What's prompted this, I don't know, but in Harper's Magazine, he wrote an article called Highbrow, Lowbrow, Middlebrow, and this was picked up by Life magazine, which asked him to do a kind of illustrated version. So here are his three representative art lovers showing what their taste was. And here we have this fellow, he's the highbrow guy. What does he have in common with Rockwell? He likes Picasso. Over here, our middlebrow guy, he's looking at American Gothic. So now we're getting a little closer to illustration, certainly not the avant-garde. And of course, our lowbrow character, he likes calendar art, girly pictures. So we're not even going to deal with him. And the chart shows you the different categories in which these highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow people, what their preferences are or were, and probably still are for that matter. Interestingly enough, in the magazine reading category, which is here, you see the upper middlebrow guy. What is he reading? Harper's. Well, Russell Lines did write the article after all. And also Vogue. Now, they were discreet enough not to put Life magazine in here. But what is our lower middlebrow guy reading? The Saturday Evening Post. So you can see that, you know, we have a certain separation here that is being written into the record by Life magazine as a way of showing that tastes, the American tastes for the more refined, the more outrageous, the more interesting art was the upper class kind of taste. But interestingly enough, Life magazine had always done art articles right from the very first issue. It was something that I think Henry Luce felt was important. It was an important aspect of American life, and it was something that should be covered in virtually every issue. But it tended to be the more conservative art. However, and they always had they never had a painting on the cover. It was always a photograph. It was a photographic documentary format. But they did have a round table on modern art in 1948, which was brought about by the returning war veterans who were on the staff, who had been exposed to European culture when they were overseas and really felt that America was lagging behind. So that there should be some acknowledgement that there was a more sophisticated world out there that Americans should be aware of, and that it was worthy of life's coverage. So Daniel Longwell, their managing editor, decided to do this very wide-ranging forum on modern art, and he invited a lot of experts to sit down and discuss what was interesting, what was new, what was controversial, why is it art, why is it good. And it went on, this roundtable, when it was covered in the magazine, went on for many, many pages. And it actually stimulated them to cover Pollock, because one of the participants was Clement Greenberg. And Clement Greenberg held up an example of Pollock's work as the sine qua non of modern art, and other guys around the table, and they were all guys, by the way, were saying, ooh, very nice idea for a necktie, very pleasant wallpaper. I'm not making this up, this is what they said. Another one said, I distrust any art that I feel I could have done myself. So here, this is the level of the discourse. But at this point, Life decides that they're going to do a feature on Pollock. And there it is. Now, contrary to myth, he was not on the cover. You can tell that that's definitely not Jackson Pollock. That is, in fact, 17-year-old Debbie Reynolds. She did not live in Fairfield County. She just was a little ingenue. They put a straw hat on her. And the feature article was Fairfield County, home to people from the literary community, the theater community who commute into New York City. So that was the focus of the feature. But the Pollock article, which went on for 3 pages, the 2-page color spread, and then there was a jump on the next page, was a life changer for Pollock. Because up to this point, although there were some serious collectors, there were aficionados, he had been written about, some of his work had sold, but not in any great volume and not for any large money. This magazine gave him priceless publicity. The kind that you could today, you'd have to go to YouTube or some other, internet forum to have it go out. And these magazines had huge circulation. Rockwell, on the other hand, this is from a similar period. I couldn't get an August cover off the internet, I'm afraid, but you probably have one here in one of the galleries. But the idea that a work of art by Rockwell was on the cover every single week from, 1916 until practically his death. This shows you the kind of exposure that he had. And let me tell you, Pollock wanted that exposure. In fact, he was thrilled if something like Harper's Bazaar or Vogue or one of the fashion magazines would run an illustration. There was a famous Vogue spread in 1951, which I don't have a picture of, but with models posing in ball gowns in front of his paintings at the Betty Parsons Gallery. And people were saying, oh, that's so... It was great because the people who bought Vogue, as you saw from Russell Lynes's categorization, they were the people with taste. And he wanted those people to buy his pictures. So for this article to come out in August of 1949 was, first of all, it had this rather controversial heading or subhead, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? A rhetorical question, which was actually answered by over 500 letters to the editor, 495 which said no. But the other 5 were crazy about it, including, by the way, a 7-year-old boy who sent him a fan letter and a little picture of himself with his Cocker Spaniel puppy. And that guy is still alive, by the way, just like one of the Rockwell models. We've been in touch with him, and he's thrilled to know that we still have his letter. And just so you might be curious to know, this painting right here was recently sold by David Geffen to a hedge fund guy for $200 million. That's the record for a Pollock. Up to today. Maybe tomorrow we'll have another record. Who knows? But this shows you the contrast of the two approaches. Pollock gets this one shot at Life magazine, and it stimulated a huge bump in his sales. He came home with over $4,000 from his winter show, which enabled him to put plumbing in the house. Not kidding. Central heating. In the spring, he shingled the building. Whenever he had extra money, he always put it into the property. So, of course, Rockwell was being paid to do these artworks for the covers. Pollock, this was just a windfall. This is some examples of what was being done in the art world in 1949 when the Pollock article came out, and also when the Rockwell cover was printed, just to show you some of the avant-garde art that was being promoted at the time. And again, remember, there really wasn't much of a market for this stuff. It was very hard to sell. Betty Parsons was Pollock's dealer, and she wasn't really pushing the work all that well, except that Life magazine article. All she had to do was open the door. But, for instance, Willem de Kooning, here's his painting up here, Gotham News. He had a show in 1948 at Charlie Egan's gallery, didn't sell anything. The next year he had another show, and he said, I don't know what I should do about the prices. And Egan said, well, you didn't sell them at $400 last year. Let's try not to sell them at $800. Meanwhile, de Kooning was actually quite a fan of Rockwell's. You know, he'd been trained classically in Holland, and he appreciated the craftsmanship, and he appreciated all the interesting details, and you know, he was also a big fan of American culture. So for him, Rockwell was not at all déclassé. Clifford Still, of course, very, very committed, very devoted to the idea of abstraction as representing something very personal, something very intimate. He said when he saw Pollock's show at the Sidney Janis Gallery, here a man has been at work, expressing himself. So this was what it was all about. A few more examples just to show you the range also. Not everybody was a splash and dash man. You know, there were plenty of guys who were doing, like William Basiotis, things that are inspired by surrealism, a very, very important influence. And you can actually see that influence on illustration as well, a more subjective approach. And also the color field painters who were doing these chromatic abstractions that were more about visualization and about mood and feeling. And here, Franz Klein, at a very transitional point in his career, the following year he made his breakthrough to the black and white paintings, and he was moving away from, he had been quite a traditional, almost illustrative painter. And of course, none of these guys would have had any recognition at all if it hadn't been for the critics, the curators, the dealers who promoted them and who believed in their work. And this was not cynical. You know, some people feel that somebody like Greenberg or Rosenberg just rode this train in order to further their own careers. But these people really believed in what they were seeing. They believed, first of all, that American art was saying something new. It was very, very hard for American artists to be taken seriously without having studied and even lived and worked in Europe, because Europe was where the avant-garde was producing the innovations. So you had people like Mary Cassatt, you have Whistler, Sargent, and up to the 20th century Alexander Calder, who really made their reputations in Europe and were part of the European art scene. But for an American artist to break into that without ever having been to Europe or being part of that development was unheard of. And Pollock was the first one to do that. So this was part of the innovation. These people were building on the avant-garde that had already achieved what the breakthroughs in Europe, but they took it farther. Now, Greenberg is often credited with being Pollock's champion, and indeed he was. He was the one who said that Pollock was the greatest painter in the United States, or one of the few great painters in the United States at that point, and that's the quote that Life magazine picked up on. But you also had, and he was writing for Partisan Review, which, let's face it, doesn't have the circulation of Life or the Saturday Evening Post, even today. And also, he wrote for, let me see, what was the other publication he was writing for at the time? The Nation. So these articles didn't reach a wide public, but they were influential with the tastemakers, they were influential with the cognoscenti. Thomas B. Hess, they also wrote books, and small monographs and things that were helpful also in spreading the word. Hess wrote one of the earliest books on American abstract painting. He was the editor of Art News, and later, very briefly, became a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, but unfortunately died very young. Harold Rosenberg, who also wrote for Partisan Review, was less theoretical, his approach was more existential. It was about the artist as an outlaw, as a person going against the grain. And his famous article for Art News in 1952, The American Action Painters, really was taken up as the rallying cry for that generation. The canvas is an arena in which to act. What the artist is expressing is existential angst. So this is the kind of thing that made abstract painting seem like what Stuart Davis called it, a belch from the unconscious. Now, Betty Parsons, as I mentioned earlier, she was Pollock's dealer. She also handled Rothko and Newman. She was somebody who was an artist herself. So she sympathized with them on a different level than an ordinary art dealer who is just, doing it to sell. She was really on the same wavelength. And I think that her great contribution was to show these people when there was so little market for them. And she was not a rich person. She really was making a living at the gallery. And so it was very hard for her to justify doing things like this that really weren't money makers. But she was very committed, very devoted, and she gave Pollock the shows that made him famous. They didn't make him rich, but they did make him famous. Sidney Janis, on the other hand, didn't make him rich, but made him very comfortably off. Sidney Janis was a manufacturer of shirts, a businessman, who was a very respected collector of modern art. And when he retired from the shirt business, he opened an art gallery in 1947, and he took over from Betty Parsons when Jackson Pollock left her because she wasn't making enough money for him. And he more than tripled Pollock's income in the first year that he represented him. So in 1952, the first year that Janis showed his work, Pollock came home with $11,580. Now, that doesn't seem like an awful lot of money today, but the average wage earner was making $2,900. So you can imagine what a windfall this was, even better than the 1949 show, and it allowed Pollock to renovate the studio. That's when he put in heat, light, insulation, and made it a year-round workplace. So this was really a big improvement in his finances, and then for the rest of his life, he was making $10,000 or $11,000 a year. Unfortunately, he only lived for another 4 years. Let's not forget the museum directors. They played a crucial role in giving the seal of approval to this work. Chief among them, of course, Alfred H. Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, who in 1944 went way out on a limb and got the acquisitions committee to agree to buy Jackson Pollock's The She-Wolf for the munificent sum of $600, discounted from $650. And Grace McCann Morley, who was even more daring in persuading her committee to purchase a Pollock that was from a traveling exhibition that was put together by Peggy Guggenheim, about whom more later. There is The She-Wolf, and this was Pollock's first museum acquisition, and Guardians of the Secret, which was bought by the San Francisco Museum of Art, which is now the SF MoMA, in 1945. So this is early on, when Pollock was still doing these pictographic paintings that were synthetic. He's still reaching for his own style. He's still assimilating Cubism. He's assimilating Native American art. He's assimilating Surrealism. And of course, Picasso and Miro and Matisse and a little of this, a little of that. But you can see that he's moving in an original direction. And these pictographic figures that you see here, these guardian figures, will reappear in many of his works even later when his work is even more abstract. And here we have Peggy. She, of course, was, if you've never read her biography, you absolutely owe it to yourself. She wrote a memoir called Out of This Century, which her family said should have been called Out of Her Head. Because Peggy, as you know, I'm sure, had a very colorful social life, and she kissed and told big time in this book. But she was a collector, an heiress. She lived in Europe and she collected avant-garde European art, surrealism, and abstract art. But when the war came along, she had to come back to her native New York, and she decided to open an art gallery on 57th Street where she would both show the collection and encourage new talent. One of the few European sophisticates who thought there was anything of any interest going on in New York. And one of the people who answered the call was Jackson Pollock. She put him into what she called her spring salon for young artists. One of his paintings was seen by a juror who was supposedly starry-eyed over it by the name of Pete Mondrian. Now, if you can imagine anybody whose style is more different from Pollock's than Mondrian, I certainly can't. But evidently Mondrian saw something in Pollock's work that excited him, and he said it was the most interesting thing he had seen here in New York or in Europe. Those three words, or in Europe, those were the clinchers. Peggy took Pollock on as her protege. She commissioned a mural from him, and she gave him solo exhibitions and a stipend, a monthly allowance. So that put him on easy street for a while, and it also put him in the right company. You know, if you're showing in the same gallery with Picasso, Matisse, Miro, and like that, there must be something good. And Peggy actually gave the first solo show to Motherwell. She gave the first solo show to Basiotis. I think she did Rothko as well. So she really helped to bring along this new generation of American avant-garde. Sadie Mae from Baltimore. If you've ever been to the Baltimore Museum, you've seen her collection. She was also interested in surrealism and abstract art. She was an artist herself. You see her carrying her art supplies there. And she was one of the first buyers to really be interested in Pollock. B.H. Friedman, who bought, I'll show you what each of these people owned. Friedman is one of Pollock's biographers and was a personal friend of his, and also an author of fiction. But he also appreciated Pollock as was a younger generation collector, someone who was coming new to the market and who just fell in love with the work in a very spontaneous way. And down at the bottom there, Ben Heller of Heller Jerseys. He was a fabric manufacturer. He owned 3 major Pollocks, including the one you see behind him here, Blue Poles. He also owned, excuse me, one, which is in the Museum of Modern Art, and Echo, which is also in the Museum of Modern Art. There is the mural of Peggy Guggenheim. It's the largest painting Pollock ever did. It's 20 feet wide and 8 feet tall. And it was painted in 1943 as a commission, and it now belongs to the University of Iowa. When Peggy left the United States and went back to Europe after the war, she tried to give it to MoMA. They didn't want it, it was too big. The Met wouldn't even look at it, wouldn't even think about it. The Whitney couldn't handle it. So she wound up giving it to the University of Iowa, and at the moment it's on tour in Europe. It's going to be at the Royal Academy in London this fall, and then it will go back to Iowa. Over here, Sadie Mae's beautiful little water birds. This is B.H. Friedman's painting, which is in Indiana now. This one's in Baltimore. That one's in Baltimore. And this is Ben Heller's one, and that's at the Museum of Modern Art. It's beautifully cleaned very recently. Now, in 1951, you could really say that abstract expressionism had arrived. It was considered to be the first truly American art movement that was accepted on an international level, but the Metropolitan Museum wasn't buying it. They not only were not buying it, they were not showing it. In fact, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So a bunch of artists were very incensed that their invitational exhibition didn't include any of the modernists, so they wrote a letter to the New York Times protesting the conservatism of the Met, and Life magazine picked up on it. So they asked their photographer, Nina Lean, to come in to the studio and do a group portrait of this group that they called the Irascibles. And there they are, there are 18 of them, and right in the center of the group, looking grumpy, is Jackson Pollock. They all look pretty serious, actually. Not a smile in the group. They did include one woman, Hedda Stern, who never lived it down. You know, she was the token woman. But it's really the moment at which these artists suddenly had some traction. And they were able to make their case, not only to the Times, but to the readers of Life, which had a circulation of over 5 million. Let's face it, this was a big audience. But it was something that helped them to shake up the art world a little bit, to show the people who mattered, the collectors, the curators, the dealers, that they were a force to be reckoned with. And they're all here, well, pretty much all of them. Actually, Hans Hofmann was in Provincetown when the photo was taken, so he couldn't be in it. But you have Motherwell, Rothko, Newman, Theodore Stamos, one of the younger ones, Jim Brooks, Adolf Gottlieb, Willem de Kooning, so, you know, Ad Reinhardt, Clifford Still. So it's really a statement that this group is now, we're here, we're going to be reckoned with, and you better take us seriously. In 1951, the legendary curator of the Museum of Modern Art, Dorothy Miller, did an exhibition. She had done a series of these shows of X number of Americans, and her 15 Americans show was really the abstract expressionist show. And it was, it featured like mini one-person shows of a group of artists, including Basiotis, Pollock, Rothko, and Still, and showed that this movement had now arrived. By 1959, when they sent this traveling exhibition to all these European countries, it was all abstract expressionism. So you have, I've given you the list, I'm not going to read them out, but this traveled to, let me see how many different countries it traveled to. Well, all over Europe. I didn't list them all, but it went to Germany, to France, to Italy, to Belgium, and I think that the last European stop was in London, and then it came to New York. So this was the kind of the triumphal grand tour. However, in 1959, the times, they were changing. As Life magazine was still trying to explain this art to an uncomprehending public. And here you see that this is, talk about, I think, you know, this guy had to think again. This is James Rorimer. He is the was the director of the Metropolitan, which had recently acquired this painting by Pollock known as Autumn Rhythm. And here is Big Jim trying to figure it out by taking a really, really close look, just like we take really close looks at these Rockwells and try to see what's going on in the details. But this was a huge two-part series that they did. The first one was November 9th, the second one was the following week on the 16th, and by this time, they felt that their audience could assimilate this material, and the first part of this article was a long individual portrait of Pollock. It went from soup to nuts his whole career. The second one featured 4 artists, de Kooning, Still, Rothko, and Klein, and tried to explain their art in kind of layman's terms. Still took extreme exception to this because his art was likened to leaping flames. And he called up Dorothy Seiberling, who was then the art editor, and said, "Bullshit." in a word. She told me this herself. He was furious because he said it had nothing to do with leaping flames. Meanwhile, 1959, as I say, a turning point. Now, 16 Americans, the next show of X number of Americans. Who do we have in this group? We have Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Rauschenberg, Frank Stella, Jack Youngerman, all of whom would challenge abstract expressionism's hegemony. And in the same year, we have this cover, which by the time this appeared, this is kind of an anomaly. You got to figure that the man in the gray flannel suit has already got it. So why is he getting so close as James Rorimer was to Autumn Rhythm, to try and figure it out? I mean, if you actually look at how far his feet are away from the wall, it looks like only about 9 inches. You know, this guy is really scrutinizing this picture. Meanwhile, the Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was published in 1955, so I'm sure Rockwell was referencing this. But it's something that he, according to, I guess, what Stephanie wrote in the label, and it's wonderful that she was able to get the original painting, he actually was considering putting a beatnik there. But he changed his mind and decided that it would be more like the highbrow guy in the highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow category, or maybe even the middlebrow guy, but just like an ordinary citizen who is still puzzled and perplexed and trying his level best to figure it out. But guess what? He doesn't have to anymore, because this is what he's getting now. He's getting the pop artists who are getting all the attention, all the press, most of it negative, by the way. When I was going through to get, the critics for abstract expressionism, who was promoting abstract expressionism, that was easy. I couldn't find a single critic who was promoting pop art. I don't think Warhol ever got a favorable review. There were other promoters, but not the critics. But this is what the museums were showing, this is what the galleries were showing, and in particular, these two galleries, Sidney Janis, who had gone over to the dark side, and literally he was considered anathema by the artists whom he used to show when he did a show in 1962 called International Exhibition of the New Realists. That is to say, the pop artists. And in fact, Motherwell, Rothko, Guston, and Adolf Gottlieb all left the gallery in protest. And I also think that it's probably why Lee Krasner took away the Pollock estate, did not allow Janis to continue with it. But Leo Castelli, who's portrayed by Warhol, you see there, opened his gallery in 1957. And he started with abstract expressionism as well, just like Janis. But he sensed the change of the wind, and he decided to go with it, and he threw his money into the pop artists. And he represented Rauschenberg and Johns from 1958. Then he took on Warhol, Rosenquist, Lichtenstein, and the other pop artists. So he and Janis, of course, was a blue chip gallery. So this was not some fly-by-night storefront. These guys had clients. And so this was a big promotion, a big boost for this fledgling new movement, which was, by the way, absolutely hated by the abstract expressionists, who had struggled to get people to understand this very personal, very subjective, very intuitive, and very abstract art. But you could get pop art. That was not hard. The two people who really helped put it over were museum people, of course, because that gives it the gold star seal of approval, Lawrence Alloway and Henry Geltzoller. Alloway was British, and he actually coined the term pop art. When he was the director of the Guggenheim Museum, he helped shape things up over there. And also Geltzoller, who was the first curator of 20th century art at the Met, was not only interested in promoting new art, but he was interested in the artists themselves. He was part of their circle. He was young, he was interested, and they accepted him because of course, his powerful position, but also because he was willing to go out on a limb for these people. If you think that the Met was a little hesitant about abstract expressionism, you can imagine the way they felt about Campbell soup cans. And there they are. not only did we have portraits of ordinary objects that everybody could understand and relate to. I mean, does everybody get a Campbell soup can? Of course they do. You don't have to use any, special mechanical mechanics of mental mechanics to figure it out. And of course, Lichtenstein famously did many of these kind of art world puns where the composition, in fact, Stephanie has one in the show, one of the brushstroke series, where he's, instead of it being a flamboyant brushstroke, it's a caricature of a brushstroke. His composition is, instead of it being an all-over poured painting like a Pollock, it's a composition book with an all-over pattern on it from a school child. So, these are the kinds of very elaborate visual puns that you do have to use a little bit of mental exercise to get, but visually these things are very, very straightforward. And of course, here you've got Rauschenberg using a Coca-Cola ad and just borrowing from popular culture, just taking, whatever he came across in the street and slapping it up on the wall. This is all of a sudden it's supposed to be art. And of course, Johns, with his map, he's using maps and flags and all kinds of other things that are actually abstract. A flag is a very abstract symbol, and so is a map. It's not the world, it's just a representation of the world in a very simplified, abstracted way. So he is making abstractions, but he's making recognizable ones in a way that the abstract expressionists were not. And then we have the collectors. Chief among them in the 60s were the Skulls, Robert and Ethel. Skull had married into a family that owned a taxi cab business, and he took over from his father-in-law, and it became known as Skull's Angels. And they originally started collecting abstract expressionism, but they came late to the party. They didn't start until the late 50s. So they wound up in the early 60s under the influence of Janus and of Castelli, turning to pop art, which then, of course, was very inexpensive, just as abstract expressionism had been in the beginning, and they were able to acquire an enormous collection of really, top-flight stuff. This portrait of Ethel Skull 36 times in the background by Warhol was his first commissioned portrait. And it set him on the road to a huge career. And of course, you can imagine what the other artists were thinking about this. They're thinking, these people don't know anything. He's a taxi owner. What does he know? And the idea that they were vulgar and they were collecting vulgar art was something that really stuck, But anyway, here is some of their collection. Now you can see it wasn't all pop art. Here are a couple of de Koonings. Which one is that? That is, it's Gotham News. Okay. Interestingly, Gotham News, if we could see it up close, one of the things that de Kooning often did when he would want to dry his paintings so that he could work over them, he would blot them with newspaper. And the newsprint would offset on the oil. So if you look closely at them, you will actually see, like a Rauschenberg, like little newspaper bits or photographs or headlines in the paintings. And that's probably what we would have in Gotham News if we could see it closely enough. But here we have a Guston, here we have a still. I mean, these people were buying what was then blue chip Abex stuff. But they quickly moved on to Johns and Warhol, and when part of their collection was sold in 1973, the pop artists were furious because they had sold their things to them for $500, $600, and then they're selling them at auction for $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. Meanwhile, you couldn't even touch them today, but Rauschenberg famously assaulted Bob's Skull at the auction. Apparently poked him in the chest and said, "You're getting rich off what I sweat over." And Skull's response is, "Go home and paint another one and you'll get rich too." So as you can see, another thing that Pollock and Rockwell have in common is that they have both entered the popular culture in ways that I'm sure neither artist could ever have imagined. And I love this New Yorker cover. When this came in the mail, I just screamed, because here they are doing, you know, what our man in the gray flannel suit is doing, except on their iPhone. Standing in front of the painting and actually looking at it on the phone, which I'm sure everyone is doing as they're taking around their little PDAs in the galleries here. But I love this one too, because what she's looking at is actually a digital version of like a drip painting that you can do online. It's a website, and you use your cursor and you move it around and you make your own Pollocky pattern. So that's what our little 21st century art lover is looking at.
And what website would that be?
I'm sorry?
What website would that be?
I think it's jacksonpollock.com or just pollock.com. I've forgotten the exact URL, but believe me, if you Google it, you will find it. It's very cute. But one more thing that they have in common, their prices. These are the auction records. As I mentioned, Pollock is way up in the stratosphere beyond that, but both in the same year sold for almost, well, 46 and 58 million. And this painting is not all that big, actually. This is kind of a medium-sized Pollock. But the fact that both of them have achieved the kind of recognition, the kind of acceptance, not only by the museum world, but by the connoisseurs, the collectors, shows you that the spectrum of what is considered art, fine art today, is so broad and so all-encompassing that it can take in a Rockwell, it can take in a Pollock, it can fold in just about everything. And I think that that's kind of wonderful, and I'm sure that if Rockwell and Pollock were alive today, they would probably be laughing over a beer together. Thank you very much.